I thank the Noble Lady Baroness Merrin for her very clear introduction to the statutory instrument, and indeed I broadly welcome this statutory instrument. There are some very important factors here. I particularly welcome the requirement to register clinical trials and for a summary of the results to be published in 12 months. It has been widely and long acknowledged in the research community very broadly that there is an issue where less successful or failed trials, or those that are not seen to have interesting results, are not published, and they can be as important or more important than the successful ones. But we've seen the failure to do that driven both by academic publishing and promotion imperatives, but also, I'm afraid, by the place of the profit motive in healthcare, where companies have very much sought to find the successful stories and rather bury the less successful stories. So that's a really strong and positive. And if there's one thing I would say, I really encourage the government to speak more about that, because I think it's important that people understand that, given the issues that we have with trust at the moment across the board. Highlighting that we're actually strengthening and improving regulation is something that I think I would really encourage the government to do. With that in mind, some of the rhetoric that's come from the government around this, and indeed some of the actions, I understand the argument about low-risk trials, particularly those, or trials identified as low risk, particularly those using medicines that have already been approved for other purposes. But I think if we acknowledge that historically some of the basis for use of some of our longest serving medicines, and indeed medical devices and medical practice, often is based on custom and practice rather than a strong foundation of evidence, I think it's important that we make sure that what we're identifying as low risk really is low risk. I'm also going to welcome the Health Research Authority, the fact that they've developed a set of questions around diversity and inclusion. We know that there's a big problem with our whole medical system of failing to acknowledge the different needs of different groups and populations, particularly disadvantaged groups and populations, and I think that's potentially a useful step towards tackling health inequalities. What I'm slightly disappointed not to see here is something that I think is perhaps a fast-growing, relatively new area, but there is a lot of work being done now on the environmental impact of clinical trials. And I note here particularly the work of the Clinical Trials and Statistics Unit of the Institute of Cancer Research, which has developed a Greener Trials Toolkit, which enables managers to identify higher emissions activities and implement targeted actions to reduce them. This is calling for accepting carbon footprinting into the development stage of new trials and including this in funding applications. Now, I note in this space there's a number of all voluntary actions, the NIHR's carbon reduction guidelines, the UK CRC monitoring group's green monitoring guidance, the UK TMN guide to efficient local management. But is the government considering putting some of these environmental steps on a statutory basis rather than simply relying on voluntary efforts? And I don't think there's much work being done in this area, but I think the Noble Lady will be aware that I've done a great deal of work on the environmental impacts of human medicines in the environment, and that's in the context of antimicrobial resistance, but also more broadly in terms of the impacts, the environmental impacts. And that's something that there is, I think, particularly in Sweden, a real drive towards encouraging looking at the environmental impacts of medicines while they're being developed. So that we can look to design medicines that have minimal environmental impact, and looking at that at the clinical trial stage. So those are a few very specific things related essentially to this instrument. But I think there is a broader question that this instrument calls for, is how do we make clinical trials more effective? Because, of course, what we want is clinical trials that work, that deliver effective medicines as soon and safely as possible. And in that context, I note that I've raised with the previous government, but haven't yet had opportunities to raise with this government, the call for a Human-Specific Technologies Act to support the full replacement of animals in medical research with new technologies. And I think when we look at that in terms of the clinical trial context, the likelihood of a cancer drug being approved and progressing from small phase-run trials to larger clinical trials is less than 6%. Alzheimer's disease has seen a clinical trial failure rate of more than 99%. We cannot rely on animal tests to indicate whether a drug is safe or effective in people. 92% of the drugs that test in animal tests that show promise fail to reach the clinic and benefit patients. So is the government, whilst thinking about the whole, if I may say, ecosystem of developing new medicines, of pharmaceutical trials, is the government looking at that more broadly? And given that I've just sprung that on the noble lady, the Minister, I will entirely understand if she'd like to write to me about that later, rather than deal with it now.